Oh boy, this one is going to be rough. It's time to talk about slugging. Hello everyone, my name is Pally and I'm an OG 2016 DBD nerd who mains Trapper and Bill. And by that definition, I'm basically the generic pumpkin spice of Dead by Daylight, but that's okay. Now, before I get fully into this, let me extend an olive branch to everyone. I 100% agree, being slugged is boring for survivors. Hell, even more so if you're a content creator. If you're slugged, it's just dead air. I acknowledge it sucks, but I want to try and dig deeper into the situation and maybe help people see slugging as more than just killers being toxic. Now listen, I'm not going to go into a long and detailed explanation about what slugging is. Slugging is the tactic of leaving survivors on the ground instead of hooking them. I know what it is, you know what it is, and what we both know is that it's been happening a lot more lately. And that's what I want to talk about in this video. You see, I consistently make the mistake of doom scrolling DBD Twitter, keeping an eye on the DBD forums and the DBD subreddit, and it's all a big mistake. And I see a lot of people with a misunderstanding of what's actually going on with the whole slugging meta. I've done a lot of research, I've compiled a lot of information, a lot of useful data, and I've talked to a lot of different people to get their perspectives, so hopefully I could shed a bit of light on the situation for everyone, so maybe we can all understand each other just a little bit better. You've probably been slugged a lot lately, or at least it feels like you have, right? And that's what I want to talk about first. A lot of the time you'll see, for example, a streamer tweet that they got tunneled every game that day. And then you'll go back and watch their VOD and you'll see that they were actually tunneled once in the span of 5 or 6 hours. The reason for this is, when one really unfun or annoying thing happens, as humans, we psychologically have that overshadow the times where that thing's not happening. It happens to everyone, and it's normal. It's how our brains work, and to an extent, I do think that complaints about slugging are very much the same. And it looks like more because there's multiple people saying it. But these are different people out of tens of thousands of people, but the overall percentage of this happening right now is likely very, very low. However, I'm not here to gaslight you. What I will say is that percentage is not going to be low for long, because soon a lot of killers are going to start slugging, and survivors' lives, I predict, are about to become very, very miserable. The immediate reaction from the survivor community to slugging is that killers don't care about survivors' fun, they think killers are being toxic, and that it's a skill issue on the killer's part because they apparently need to slug. And I can see how it can look that way, but let me add some context to this situation. Number one, it's not that killers don't care about survivors' fun. They just don't feel responsible for it anymore, and I think this is a very important distinction. Nobody should feel responsible for anyone's fun, and there's nothing wrong with that, survivor or killer. If you disagree, let me ask you, and be honest with yourselves, really stop and think about it. When you queue up as survivor, how often do you go out of your way to make the game more fun for the killer? Are you gonna chill on gens? Are you gonna not pre-drop pallets? Are you gonna not blinded pallets? Are you gonna not use flashbangs, which currently have no counterplay at the time of recording this? Are you gonna not run to main building, which is notoriously the most annoying and boring place to chase a survivor? Are you gonna not run exhaustion perks? Are you gonna put yourself in an intentional disadvantage for the sake of how much fun the killer may or may not be having? Of course not. I've never seen a survivor do this, and you shouldn't have to. Number two, they aren't trying to be toxic. Now don't get it twisted, there are some players in the DBD community that exist to make their opponents' lives miserable, and that goes for both killers and survivors. We know they exist, and they're just miserable human beings, but they are definitely the minority. And number three, it's got nothing to do with killers needing to slug. Killers don't need to slug. And make no mistake, slugging isn't just some magical easy button. However, slugging is the smartest play at the moment in most pub games, and oftentimes simply more fun compared to the alternative. And don't worry, I will explain. Now I'll discuss the truth about slugging, why killers are doing it, and why slugging will become even more popular in the very near future. And then after all that, we'll try to figure out a solution. So, why are killers slugging? Well, let me share with you a couple of personal experiences that I've had recently. So the first scenario, I spawn in as Trapper as I do on Hawkins. Couldn't find anyone for the first 2 minutes. I didn't even have Corrupt for them to hide from. They just wanted to immerse. I eventually find a Claudette. She pre-drops every single pallet she runs to. She uses an exhaustion perk to extend the chase at the very moment I should have caught her. And then I finally get her after overall a boring chase. And at this point, I still haven't seen anyone else. So I face a wall, I pick up the Claudette, and a Kate runs into the room with light-footed and drops a flashbang inside my character model because of a bug with the flashbang perk. And even though I was facing a wall, that entire chase meant nothing because the Claudette got off my shoulders. I finished the match, I even won the match, and I moved on. But that flashbang save stuck with me. There was nothing I could have done to counter it. I was already looking at a wall. It just wasn't fun. It felt like all the effort that I put in wasn't rewarded. The reward I should have received was stolen from me. The second scenario takes place immediately after the previous game on Hawkins. Now, I don't typically slug because I like to go for traps, but the flashbang was still on my mind and I decided to give it a try. So both out of frustration and curiosity, I throw on Surge, Knockout, Mindbreaker, and Sloppy, which is a typical slugging build these days, and I spawn in on Garden of Joy of all maps, and I immediately went to main building to do a bit of trap setup. And just as I was leaving main building, I hear one of my traps get disarmed, which made me go back to main building, and I spotted an Ellen Ripley making a run for it. And despite her holding W across the map, I managed to down her at an LT by the parking lot in about 30 seconds. However, as soon as I took her down, I noticed two survivors nearby, both armed with flashbangs, ready to ruin my hard work. What they didn't realize is that I had no intention of picking up their teammate. The rest of the match turned into an absolute slugging spree until all the survivors were down, and after that, I hooked them. Some bled out during the chaos, and I ultimately secured a 4K. The thing is, Knockout did almost nothing here because these people, I'm pretty sure, were like at least a 3-man Swift, or simply knew exactly where to go to revive their teammates. I don't know. Sloppy and Surge were the only perks that gave me any real value in this match. Now let me tell you something, it felt good. Not to make survivors miserable, and believe me, I did. They had plenty to say about it in the in-game chat, but it felt good to not have to stop chasing. The non-stop chase aspect of slugging is so much fun. It felt like a lot like the original 2v8, or kind of like the anniversary event where you didn't have to pick up a survivor and carry him to a hook. You had more time. It also felt good to not have to worry about Scourge hook RNG or just hook RNG in general. It felt good to not have to worry about annoying flashbangs or flashlights or hook sabos or body blocking, all of that. It felt really good to not have to worry about gens popping in the background as I wasted my time picking up survivors and carrying them all the way to a hook. Now, I promise you, slugging isn't just some easy mode. It was not an easy game, especially as Trapper, and I did a bunch more of these for the science, also as Trapper, and I had very similar results in some games, but I also lost some games too. And that's really what it's all about, right? It's about fun at the end of the day. I didn't care that I was winning or losing. I was actually just having more fun because it was nonstop chase. All the best parts of DBD were there, front and center, and it was fun. And I felt like I was being rewarded for my pressure, which heavily contributes to the fun factor. And that's what it's all about. It's about having fun. But the question becomes, why is it so fun? Well, to answer that question, let's start by comparing the advantages to hooking versus the advantages to slugging. So what are the advantages to hooking versus slugging? Well, we'll go with the easy one. Number one, survivor uses up a hook state. Okay, that's good, that's solid. We like that. Number two, you get maximum pressure, but only on specific hooks on some maps. For example, upstairs in Ormond or a basement hook, but that's all RNG based. Number three, hook-based perks activate. So like Pop and Pain Res, Grim, Deadman's, but wait, a lot of those have actually been nerfed. A lot of people don't think they're worth running anymore. So we'll talk about that later too. Number four, you get marginally more blood points. Not a lot more, but marginally more compared to slugging. Number five, survivors will maybe have more fun? Question mark? I don't know. Number six, survivors won't berate you for slugging. And I have talked to a lot of people, and these are the only ones I could actually come up with that made sense. Now it's time for the contentious look at the advantages to slugging versus hooking, and a lot of this might shock you or even maybe make you angry. I don't know. So number one, same pressure as when you hook a survivor. You literally get the same pressure. They have to go to that survivor, they have to get them up, unless they've got Unbreakable, but if that's the only perk you got to worry about, who cares? Number two, no wasting time carrying the survivor to a hook. Number three, not giving survivors a huge tell of your location. You know that big bubble when you hook someone for survivors? Number four, no 4%. Number five, no base kit borrow time. Number six, you avoid flashlights and flashbangs. Number seven, you avoid pallet saves and power struggle. Number eight, you avoid hook sabos completely. Number nine, you avoid the meta second chances survivors get after being unhooked. Number 10, non-stop chases. This is the most fun part of the game. You just never have to stop chasing. Number 11, slug survivors can be used as bait. You can't really do that with hooked survivors because of the anti-cam. Number 12, you never have to worry about hook spawn RNG. Number 13, counters survivor oak offerings, which I've been seeing more and more lately for some reason. Number 14, the killer will usually have more fun. And number 15, and this is just to be cheeky, Survivors won't berate you for hooking. Now you might think this is a long list, but I could have listed every single off the hook second chance and I didn't. I grouped them all into one entry. Oh, actually there is one more thing. Slugging counters the give up on hook epidemic. Now the truth here is the only real downsides to slugging for the killer is you might deal with Unbreakable and Boon Exponential. Maybe you'll get a little bit less blood points. That's pretty much it. But the advantages far outweigh the disadvantages. The advantages are you don't have to deal with any of that stuff that is, for all intents and purposes, boring to verse. It's boring to go against. And the DBD community is a community built on voicing what's boring to go against. So we should all unite on the fact that things that are boring are boring. And it's not just survivors that can find things boring. You know what I mean? In any case, let's have a look at the perks that are countered either partially or fully by simply not hooking survivors. And when I say partial counter, I mean it's got effects outside of hook-based effects, but the hook-based effect is countered. So from the top of the list to the bottom, I think I got them all. Aftercare, Babysitter, Background Player, Blood Rush, Boil Over, Borrowed Time, Breakdown, Breakout, Camaraderie, Dead Hard, Decisive Strike, Deliverance, Desperate Measures, Fast Track, Flashbang, Flip Flop, Kindred, Leader, No One Left Behind, Off the Record, Power Struggle, Reassurance, Resilience, Resurgence, Sabotage, Second Wind, Shoulder the Burden, Slippery Meat, Spine Chill, Will Make It, and Wicked. And you know what? I'll give it to you. A lot of these perks you will never see. A lot of them are very niche, right? So let's remove the ones you barely ever see from the list. And now let's highlight the ones that you see fairly frequently. And now let's highlight the perks in this list that are full on meta and appear in nearly every single game. One thing we need to keep in mind here is killers are doing this because it's fun. And part of what makes it fun is the fact that slugging just nullifies a lot of the stuff that is boring to verse. A lot of people will say really silly stuff like, well, just don't tunnel. But if you play enough killer, you'll often find yourself getting hit with anti-tunnel perks more when you're not tunneling than when you actually are. Ask any content creator who plays a lot of killer how often an anti-tunnel perk is used as an offensive tactic instead of the intended purpose, which is to stop you from tunneling that survivor. It's not fun, and it can be simply avoided by not hooking the survivor while delivering nearly the same amount of pressure and also a less monotonous gameplay loop that just gives you non-stop chases. Now that's only part of the story because most of these perks have been around for years and slugging has only gained a lot of traction recently. So let's look at more recent changes that behavior has made to DBD that have led up to this point. Let's start with number 1, the hook timer increase. Now it could be reasonably argued that this helps assist against camping, but the issue is the reasoning given was, well, it's only fair because we increased generator times. Of course, I'm paraphrasing, but that's the reason behavior gave. But what you need to understand is gen time and hook state time are not the same thing. There's only one killer and there's 4 survivors. It doesn't translate to the same impact or value. The extra time on hook is miles more impactful for survivors than the extra gen time is for killers. Because even if the killer isn't camping, that just removes 20 seconds of hook pressure per survivor, which is about a quarter of a generator's progress, give or take a second or two. And that doesn't seem like a lot, but when there's 4 survivors to a game, it is a lot. And the point of hooking survivors is to force their teammates off the gens to make the save. That's literally what hook pressure is. So this made hooking a lot less rewarding just by proxy of removing such a huge amount of potential pressure. Now number 2, and this will be a contentious one, but this is some of the most recent changes to happen to the game, and it's kind of where the spark for slugging really began. Multiple perks that would otherwise provide incentive and reward for taking the time to hook survivors have now been nerfed to the point where many consider them to not even be worth running anymore if you want to have fun and feel rewarded for doing your objective. Your objective, of course, being to eliminate the survivors. Dead Man Switch, Pop Goes the Weasel, Grim Embrace, and Scourge Hook Pain Resonance were all collectively nerfed in patch 8.0 with the release of the Dungeons & Dragons chapter. The reasons given by behavior for the nerfs to these perks were that apparently the earning requirement for them was, quote, too easy to achieve, and that the synergy between some of them was, quote, too effective. The issue with this is just flat out not true at higher level gameplay. What's the one thing all of these perks have in common? To get value from them, you have to chase, hit, chase more, down, pick up, and hope there's no flashbangs, carry the survivor to a hook, and hook them before you get any value from them. That's a lot of steps, and a lot of the time wasted with a reward that just keeps getting smaller and less worth the time it takes. Especially if you think about the fact that survivors have had many gen progression perks that make gens go faster either buffed or introduced in the last year, all at the same time that the gen regression is getting nerfed. It's a little weird, right? So gens are not only going faster, but the rewards for gen regression is much, much lower. Now you might be thinking, well, what about Nurse? What about Billy? What about Blight? What about Dracula? What about Spirit and all the other S tier and A tier killers that make these perks really, really effective? And you have a point. The problem with that is, what about the other 80% of the killer roster? You see, and therein lies the problem with killers like Nurse, Billy, Blight, all these top tier killers, because if you balance around them, you're leaving a lot of these perks just not really worth it for the ones below them, because they can't get the same value from them that the top tier killers can. Now remember, these nerfs all happened in one patch, and very soon after that, slugging very slowly started to gain traction, and now we're at a point where it's getting very, very common. And only now is it becoming something that is pushing its way into the meta. Many of us predicted this a while ago. As soon as perks that incentivized hooking survivors started getting nerfed, many of us with experience said this would lead to slugging, much like the perks that incentivized going for separate survivors being nerfed led to more tunneling. A prime example of that was barbecue and chili having its blood point stacks removed. Tunneling notably shot up back then because this perk that everyone used that incentivized a non-tunneling playstyle at its core for a huge reward was just not worth the perk slot for most killers anymore if you didn't have mobility. The only perks killers have now that give any real tangible value versus the time and risks involved just to pick up and hook survivors are things like Gift of Pain or Floods of Rage. But with Scourge Hook RNG being the dumpster fire it is, those are really only useful with the help of the new Scourge Hook perk, Jagged Compass. But people are already complaining about that, and we know where that usually leads. So what is the solution to slugging? Well, if you look at the vocal people on Twitter or Reddit or any other place, you'll see the knee-jerk reaction is to demand a base kit unbreakable of some sort. However, as fun as you think that may be, do you really think it's healthy to keep handing out base kit second chances? Again, I know being slugged is boring, and the knee-jerk reaction is going to be, yes, base kit unbreakable! But at the end of the day, if the survivor is on the ground, that does mean they were outplayed. And the entire reason this is happening in the first place is because hooking survivors isn't rewarding like slugging is. And the more you take away things that make killer feel rewarding, the longer your queue times will get. Having said that, I think the solution here, rather than punishing killers for slugging and rewarding survivors for being slugged, or even more confusing, rewarding killers for not slugging by not punishing them. Yes, that's a thing that people think of. I think the best course of action is to practice a little bit of positive reinforcement. It's been proven to work in the past. Let's give killers a reason to hook survivors again. That doesn't make it seem like it's to their detriment like it currently is. And I'm not just talking about a blood point bonus because I don't even think that's enough anymore. I think it needs to be met with some sort of understanding on the part of survivors as well. For example, was Pop and Pain Res powerful? Of course. But did it reward hooking? Absolutely. Now, it's not necessarily about reverting the changes made to these perks, but being more understanding of why killers use some things and why those things actually contribute to a healthier gameplay loop, and that there's more purpose behind those things than to just slow down generators. And of course, at the end of the day, maybe having that little bit of extra forethought before deciding something should be nerfed and immediately going to Twitter to demand said nerf. Catching survivors in a chase, while map dependent, isn't always the most time efficient process. Of course, it varies by killer and whether they have anti-loop and other factors, but even some of the most known and beloved creators out there have gone on record saying that with things like exhaustion perks and windows of opportunity and other things at play, even what would normally be considered a mediocre survivor can lead a decently long chase if they just pre-drop pallets or run around main building, which sadly many survivors do anyway. Especially on really unbalanced maps like Iria Crows, Gideon's, or Badham. Then after all that, now you have to spend time risk picking them up, carrying them to a hook. Make no mistake, I'm not saying it's hard. Most chases are about running out the clock, not necessarily about difficulty. But time is always against the killer, so this raises the question, how can we reward hooking in a way that matches the effort required to actually do it? Now, I'll probably get a lot of pushback for this, but many believe what it will take is for survivors to be a little more introspective with themselves and realize that yes, while things like Pop and Pain Res, Deadman's, and Grim were powerful, they accomplish more than just gen slowdown. Perks like that made hooking survivors worth it for the killer. It made hooking survivors feel rewarding. Would you rather be slugged every game, or would you rather have an interactive game? What was worse, Pop and Pain Res, or being slugged repeatedly until your entire team was down? It may also be wise to maybe think if maybe, just maybe, survivors have been given too many perks that just offer them a second chance for getting off the hook. and many of them tend to wave them in the killer's face or use their anti-tunnel as an offensive tactic just to have another one to bail them out when the killer punishes them for that. I can't tell you how many times I've been hit by a DS when I'm not even tunneling, or how many times I've had someone with off the record run across the map from where they were unhooked, body block a door fully healed as I chase their teammate just to DS me when I down them. Anti-tunnel, by the way. That kind of stuff isn't fun, or rather, that kind of stuff is boring to go against. Killer players are trying to have fun, just like you. Most aren't against survivors having fun. Killer players just want survivors to match the same kind of energy that they expect from them. Many killers would go back to hooking survivors if they were rewarded for it in the course of gameplay, as evidenced by the fact that the slugging meta has only really come into effect now and not before. And this will likely get me even more hate, but the only thing I know isn't the solution is to give survivors another base kit second chance to fix this. Even Spooky Loop said it, that they should just have a faster bleed out button. If you really wanted a quick and dirty fix, that's what you would do. If the problem really is that it's too boring to spend all that time on the ground, then that should be an adequate fix, but I think that's just another band-aid. What really needs to happen is behavior needs to find a way to make hooking survivors advantageous and rewarding again for killers, because positive reinforcement goes a long way. Honestly, at the end of the day, the only ones we can really lay the blame on here, respectfully, is Behavior Interactive. It could be argued that in their efforts to listen to the community, they maybe listen to them a bit too much, or maybe they do what I do and spend way too much time doom scrolling Twitter and Reddit and sometimes take it way too seriously. Either way, my hope, which will probably go unfulfilled, is that someone at Behavior Interactive sees this, because at the time of recording this, the most recent player satisfaction survey dedicated a bunch of questions to asking about slugging at the very end of it, and none of them were from the killer's perspective. It was all entirely from the survivor's perspective and how they felt about slugging. And that's extremely worrying, because it appears that they aren't looking at why killers are slugging, but rather just how survivors feel about it. And that's terrible, because there's two sides to every story and everything happens for a reason. But anyway, that's it for this video. If there was anything I wish you would take away from this video, it's that everyone, killers and survivors alike, should try to better understand each other, understand their opponents. A little understanding, a little empathy, and a little conversation goes a long way. Don't be so quick to attack each other. Don't be so quick to assume we're trying to make each other miserable. If you want to see me live the hard life of a trapper main, you can catch me streaming live over on Twitch at twitch.tv/PallyLive. If you like what you saw here, feel free to like and subscribe. This has been Pally, and I will see you in the next one.